Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Trong, and I'm the Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. On behalf of the entire board and staff, I warmly welcome the panelists and all attendees to the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to read a statement which acknowledges the original stewards of a land that the Chinese American Museum resides on. The Chinese American Museum acknowledges that this virtual event is taking place across the continent of North America, also known as Turtle Island, original and unceded territories of hundreds of 100 of indigenous people and nations. We acknowledge and honor the original caretakers of the various places our speakers are joining us from. Today, I'm joining you from downtown Los Angeles in the facilities of the Chinese American Museum, physically located on the historic village of sites of Yangna in the Tobanga, unceded traditional territories of the Gabrielino, Shoshone, Quiche, and Tomba indigenous peoples of these lands. To this day, there are at least 7 tribes of the Gabrielino people who maintain an ongoing presence, power, and relations among the people, their natural relations, and the lands they belong to. I invite you to remember the indigenous people who affirm their sovereignty and ongoing relations with the lands you currently occupy, and ask yourself, how do you, your people, or your organization honors these relatives? Thank you for serving this land acknowledgement with me. Before we begin the program, here are some things you might need to know. The program is being recorded and may be made public for viewing in the future. Please keep your microphone and your video off during the duration of the program. At the end of the program, we'll take a group photo. At this point, a CAN staff member will provide instructions to turn on your video for those who wish to participate. For the best experience, we ask participants to watch and speaker view. The chat box is currently unavailable. However, if you need assistance, you may still send a private chat to the host Chinese American Museum. We are pleased to be hosting a series of commemorative events, including this panel of cultural and civic leaders engaging in work to realign our history to reflect the experiences of those who have been historically marginalized. While this racial violence discussed in this panel happened in the past, understanding the systematic underpinnings of these tragedies could not be more relevant and important today. These speakers today not only acknowledge but elevate underrepresented issues, but actively work for positive change in the future. Our moderator today is rapper and activist Jason Chu. He will introduce the rest of the panelists. Chu makes music to speak hope and healing in a broken world, blending introspective lyricism with high energy and live performances. Jason has shared poetry at the Bomber White House, been featured in the Chinese American Museum, and tours extensively. His music and work on Asian American identity and hip hop culture has been featured on Warrior, Bruce Action, and recognized by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, and has been on BBC, NBC, and heard at universities such as UPenn, Stanford, NYU, and beyond. We're grateful to have Jason join us and call him a friend. Thank you, Jason. I pass it on to you to introduce the rest of the panelists.
Hey, thank you so much, Michael. Everyone, it's a real pleasure to be with you. This is such a solemn week, but it is also in some ways, it's a commemoration, right? A commemoration of not the things that have been done to our communities, but the ways that our communities have responded with resilience, with strength, with growth. And today's panel in particular is such a special one. Our topic today is collective memory. And as such, we've gathered a panel of incredible civic leaders, journalists, educators to speak about how they hold, how they build, and how they build upon the collective memory of their communities. So without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm going to introduce our panelists. The first that I'd love for y'all to send your attention towards is Mayor Lamar Thorpe of Antioch, California. In 2020, Mayor Thorpe was elected the 41st mayor of his city. Antioch is one of California's oldest cities and one of the fastest growing areas in the San Francisco Bay region. With a population of over 115,000, Antioch has become the heart of Eastern Contra Costa County, offering a variety of employment, shopping, and recreational activities. Mayor Thorpe is a U.S. Navy veteran and a graduate of the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., with an undergraduate degree in sociology and women's studies and a master in women's studies. So Mayor Thorpe is the first of our three panelists. Second, we also have Carmen Fields. Carmen is a fixture in the greater Boston journalism community for over 30 years. Her experience includes print and broadcast journalism, education, and corporate and nonprofit media relations. Carmen's PBS documentary, Going Back to T-Town, about her hometown, Tulsa, Oklahoma, first aired in 1993 on The American Experience. It was rebroadcast in 2021 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So thank you so much for joining us, Carmen. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Marcos Aguilar. Marcos is the co-founder and executive director of Semillas, Sociedad Civil, and Anahuacalmecac International University Preparatory of North America. Mr. Aguilar is a trained consultant for the International Baccalaureate and has co-authored an international training for educators called Beyond Symbolism, Indigenous Ways of Knowing. Marcos is such a part of the fabric of our city, engaged in various high-stakes campaigns involving advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples, access to quality education for Indigenous youth, and decolonizing public spaces across the city and county of Los Angeles. So you should have seen all of them. You will get very familiar with all of our storied panelists as this next hour 15 goes on. But first, Marcos, you know, we're talking about civic memory. We're talking about collective memory. And this first round of questions, I'd like to sort of focus on each of our individual panelists. You have such a wealth of experience. And our first question, I would like to direct to you. You know, this is so often racial history in America, the history of oppression and hurt in America, is framed as what they did to us. And it can remove our agency, right? It can remove the agency of Indigenous peoples, of people of color, of other marginalized communities. And I'd love to hear from your perspective, what have you done, or what's the work that you've been doing to reclaim agency over your own community's past and memories?
Thank you very much, brother, and thank you very much to the rest of the panelists and the Chinese American Museum for the invitation to include our voices and our struggle, our history. And I also want to thank and recognize the Gabrielino Shoshone Tribal Council that authorized me and is guiding me in this participation. And it's with their blessings that I speak. If you could share the slides, I think that'd be helpful at this point also, to start with the first slide, and just share some imagery about who we are and how we refer to this idea about agency. And that's first of all in our language, Nikan Tochan. Nikan Tochan means here are our homelands, here in our homelands. We started a school in 2002 because as teachers and as parents and certainly as students that have grown up in the public school system, we found that there was no place for us, and that the place that there was a violent one, was a dark corner. And so we developed the agency of the community to organize an autonomous Indigenous school, like many other Indigenous communities have done across the hemisphere. And that we're a part of an emerging movement of Indigenous communities, families and parents, nations that are seeking to find ways to open pathways to understanding of ourselves and to healing of ourselves in our homelands, and do that when we are children, as our children, and to keep our children close to us, as opposed to the experience that has taken place for over 500 years now of having our children removed from us. And so we have to, you know, find that place of our own between wanting to be a part of a vision of a future of education that is inclusive of our community, but also not having our children stripped from us physically or violently or spiritually or mentally, which is a part of our history with education. Our education is ancestral and is, you know, predates the invasion of the continent by Europeans. And this reference to Anahuacalmecac is a reference to that ancestral history. And we want to recognize that in this space, the ancestors of that massacre in 1871, we're in a space that had seen massacres for a few centuries, and that had become where that had become commonplace, although perhaps not as specific to that particular community and to the presence of the Chinese workers and families and community members whose loss we mourn even to this day. But we also recognize that that space was a space of violence in that plaza. If you could switch to the next slide, please. Thank you. Anahuacalmecac was born in 2002 as a K-12 charter school that was founded in Northeast Los Angeles, a community that is ancestrally known as Otsugna in general, which is a beautiful name of the place of the flowers. And this place became our home with the blessings of Chief Vera Yana Rocha of the Gabrielino Shoshone Nation. And she, with her husband, Manuel Rocha, taught us about agency as students at UCLA, while my wife and I and several other organizers and activists were finding our place and trying to understand ethnic studies and Chicano studies and dealing with these racist laws in California, dealing with wars, like we hadn't seen for decades. But our community became a target very shortly after in 2006 of devastating attacks against us for being Mexican, for being indigenous, a target against our students. We taught Mandarin Chinese in our school, and we saw that as a part of a natural next relationship in our community. I grew up in Mexicali, Baja California Norte, one of the largest Chinatowns outside of Mexico City and all of Latin America. And so I saw my friends speaking Chinese and Cantonese in particular, and Spanish and English. And so I knew it was possible. And we wanted to bring that experience into our school. We were specifically targeted for teaching Mandarin in our schools. It was equated to child abuse, in fact. But we knew that type of a global vision of education was important. It was something that should have been natural to Los Angeles, and it shouldn't have been attacked and targeted that way. That's the building of our school with the images of our natural relationships to the corn, to the rain, to the four elements. And this is something that our students understand and learn about in the course of our curriculum, something we call native science and the ceremony of that science. You can switch to the next slide, please. So the reality about our presence as Native people in Los Angeles is an urban one. Even with the amazing beauty around us, we all know, those of us that are living in or around Los Angeles or have visited, how beautiful the mountains are, how beautiful the ocean is, the islands, the parks. I mean, even though we're park poor in many ways, there next to our school, there's probably at least 700 acres worth of open space parks. That's an image of one of our students after one of our ceremonies at the top carrying our pantli, which is an image of our school. And our approach to agency isn't just about the human connection, but about strengthening that human connection as Native peoples through an education that is immersed in cultural identity, in heritage, and in healing through nature and land-based traditions that unite the traditional environmental concepts of stewardship as relationship, not as management, with modern innovations in education and other sustainable technologies that we need to be able to grapple with and to hopefully put to work for us. Can you transition to the next slide, please? I want to center the conversation about where the massacre took place and where the Chinese American Museum is by quoting tribal chairman of the Gabrielino Shoshone tribe, Manuel Rocha, Vera's son, who is now heading that tribe, and to think about that relationship to the lands as who belongs to the lands, not who does this land belong to, but who belongs to the lands, because the peoples that are indigenous to this territory, which in Tongva language is being referred to as Tovangar, which is like a universal name of the entire region of the Tongva world, of the Gabrielino world, see themselves as the seeds of Povagna. And that was a term that tribal chair Nick Rocha has developed to try to unite the concept that there are 6 tribal councils that are actively recognized as Gabrielino bands of mission Indians, formally recognized by the Native American Heritage Commission of California, who self-identify themselves as Quiche, as Tongva, as Shoshone, and that even though they have distinct identifications for their tribal councils and for their tribes, that as a people, they all emerge from their creation stories of Pavagna, which is now, there's a historic site located in Cal State Long Beach, which has been saved and has been dedicated to the history of Pavagna. The picture on the bottom left you see is an image of the church by the placita. Our students are researching actively in one of our classes called Indigenous Voice, history of the indigenous peoples of this territory of Tovangar. And we're looking forward by making memory. We want to recognize that Los Angeles includes persons and communities from over 200 Native nations from across North America. They may be relocated communities that were forcibly relocated by the United States government from American Indian tribes across the continental United States and from Alaska, or they may be forcibly relocated due to land dispossession. As we know that there are a great deal of Hawaiian brothers and sisters, Native Hawaiians, unfortunately in the prison system in California as a result of that land displacement. And we know that indigenous Mexicans have also been present, both as a part of the colonial settlement of these territories through the Spanish, and then, for a couple of decades, the Mexican government, but for well over 200 years. And that, of course, is an obvious. And that the true place names and centers of culture and community across Los Angeles include these names of Otsugna, Pachanga, Chokishingna, and Pavagna, and that these are places to be recognized. And the place, if you could advance to the next slide, please, the place where the museum is and where this massacre took place is known as Yangna, itself a site of struggle. This is a map from a research article that our classes are studying, and we're in communication with one of the authors of the article. It was really dramatic to me to see a couple of things. First of all, that Yangna was a viable political entity and space and village up until 1813, and that surpassed the legacy of the imposition of the mission system. Yangna being pretty much right around where the Chinese American Museum is, and that press is important to remember, because if you were to look today for a space in El Pueblo Historical Park, you will only find a very small plaque that recognizes the Gabrielino indigenous peoples of the city of Los Angeles. There was a very recent announcement by the mayor's office that the Serra Park will be renamed, and that a cultural easement will be dedicated to the Gabrielino tribes for their cultural purposes, and that's great. I think it's important that those ideas about repurposing and rededicating access to traditional homelands is important. But let's recognize also that that park is an abandoned section of the historical center of Los Angeles, and that it itself is a mark on that displacement. I also want to point out that not too far from Yangna, if you look at number 10 on the slide, there was a rancheria called La Rancheria de los Pipimares. The Pipimares was the name given to the indigenous peoples of the islands of Catalina, of the island of San Nicolas, that were removed from the islands, forcibly removed from the islands and brought to the mission. And then even among the indigenous peoples of Yangna were given a separate place, a segregated space in which to live, that it itself was not too far. It was around 7th Street. That was not too far, and that there were complaints levied against those indigenous peoples because they were bathing in the river. And these are part of the records of the City Hall of the City Council of Los Angeles. The violence that marks that then after 1813, both of these original sites were removed, that people were further displaced, and that all indigenous memory was basically terminated in the central core of Los Angeles in many ways. I want to emphasize that the indigenous peoples of San Nicolas Island, which is farther into the ocean from Catalina Island is known around the world through the famous novel The Island of the Blue Elephant. Thinking this woman was alone in the island, and that somehow she was saved by the Spanish. I think it's important to keep in mind that there was a massacre of Nicoleños shortly before her people were removed from the island by the order, apparently by the Santa Barbara mission priest, and were removed to San Pedro and displaced entirely. There were fur traders that had committed a massacre on the island shortly before that and had decimated the people that were living completely autonomously, completely self-sufficiently in the island, and that had done so despite the presence of the mission on the mainlands. And that when she came and was brought years later to the city of to the mission of Santa Barbara, her people had been displaced even from where they were taken to in San Pedro and in Los Angeles, and had basically been adopted out as basically entrusted to and enslaved to other families in the pueblo at that early history. And then the American invasion, of course, put a final lock on that. And the last slide I'll share with you is just that in our truth telling, we want to recognize that our language is fire, and so we want to uplift the languages, indigenous languages across the county and across the state. Next year, indigenous languages will be celebrated for a decade across the world. We want to recognize that our environment is everything, and that we recognize that Mini Huichoni water is life, even here in Los Angeles. And I think we're recognizing that even more as these new orders and threats of water scarcity are being shared with us on a daily basis. And that indigenous peoples, be they from South America, Central America, or Mexico, are in our homelands here too, even as we're guests and visitors with the Tongva Gabrielino peoples here. And that every one of us is a seed, and every one of us is a seed planter. I'm not sure if we have enough time for the little video I wanted to share, but feel free to share it if you can.
Yeah, I think given the time and given that we've got so much to get through today, we might just need to move forward to our next first round question. But thank you so much, Marcos, for the work you're doing, and also for pointing out how this history overlaps, right? Indigenous history, Chinese American history, Asian American history, and of course, Black, Latinx history. We all need to know how they intersect. And calling up next, Carmen, you have done so much work in this same space of education and holding history. And I direct the same question to you. What's your process been like of reclaiming agency of your own community's past and memories, specifically all the work you've done on your hometown of Tulsa?
Well, reclaiming agency in our community, of our communities, what an idea that is. During April and May of this year, you may have noticed, and those of you that are in our audience this evening, you may have noticed the airwaves, the newspapers, magazines, social media were inundated with stories about this place called Tulsa, Oklahoma, or T-Town to those of us who know her well. Well, Tulsa is the place of my birth, where I attended Ralph J. Bunch Elementary School, Marian Anderson Junior High School, and Booker T. Washington High School. It is the place that nurtured the noted historian, Dr. John Hope Franklin, musician Earl Bostic, vocalist Roy Milton, later the rock and roll group called the Gap Band. In the early 1990s, I was honored to help bring the story of my hometown to a national viewing audience via the PBS vehicle called The American Experience. The task was to tell a story about the interior of segregation. The documentary that first aired in '93 was called Going Back to T-Town. In a minute, I will show a brief clip that gives a snapshot of the Tulsa as I knew it in the 50s. In spite of all the positive energy, I would learn that Tulsa had buried a deep, dark secret. But first, let's take a brief look at a once upon a time in T-Town.
I'm going back to T-Town to get my women in line. Yes, I'm going back to T-Town just to get my women in line.
Greenwood growing up was a very vibrant place, full of life.
There were 35 or 40 stores from the top of Greenwood until Pine, and they were on each side of the street.
My eyes are brown.
Businesses were booming, people were living well, and of course we supported one another because we didn't move out of the community, so the money turned around in the community.
My teeth are pearly white.
There were beer taverns, there were sundry shops, ice cream parlors, there were 3 or 4 drugstores, there were beauty parlors, barber shops, hotels, and entertainers.
The whole shooting match was there, so anytime you wanted to find out what was going on or who was in Tulsa, all you had to do was be on Greenwood Thursday night through Saturday night. The spirit was such that you, on one corner there was the Holy Ghost, and the other was heroin. Not that that is a desired thing, that's a reality.
Come down to Greenwood tomorrow, I'll sing these blues some more.
Tulsa was highly segregated then. If you were over on the other side of town, in downtown Tulsa, and you did the wrong thing, a policeman would stop you and he would tell you in very nasty terms where you could eat and where you could drink and where you couldn't drink. And then they had signs up, you know, no colored could for drinking fountains and eating places. And we stood up. We couldn't even stand up and eat in Tulsa for a long time. It's a downtown area. But we didn't worry about that too much because in the Greenwood area we were quite complete. We were unique.
Well, thank you. That's my hometown as I remembered it when I was growing up. I should note that the documentary was rebroadcast in February of 2021 as part of a commemoration of the 1921 so-called Tulsa Massacre. That was the deep, dark secret that was very purposefully hidden from us, so many of us, for such a long time. It's a story of the destruction of a prosperous Black business enclave known as Black Wall Street. Here's what happened. On May 31st, just as Booker T. Washington High School was preparing for graduation ceremonies, word spread throughout the community that there was going to be a lynching, that whites had planned to lynch a young Black man accused of attacking a white elevator operator in a downtown building. Well, the Black men, in an attempt to thwart the heinous act, took arms. What ensued was a near total destruction of the Black community. Some 30 blocks of businesses and homes were destroyed, and a massacre of some 300 Black students, Black citizens who were buried secretly in mass graves. What was called at first a race riot was barely whispered about, and it was not until work on the documentary that I and a team of producers and researchers were able to enlist some of the survivors to help tell the story of that fateful time. More importantly, the documentary was also able to demonstrate the resiliency of the community, because those descriptions that you just heard in the clip was of the Black Tulsa that was rebuilt after the destruction. When you talk about reclaiming agency, I think of the work of that assignment, of which I am particularly proud. That is because I could share the truth of my community, the strength of the community forebears, and their sheer grit. When many people think of the Black community, it is often as a ghetto. The Black community of my youth had all the advantages. I took piano lessons from one of my mother's best friends, a teacher who also directed our church's annual performance of Handel's Messiah. I had ballet and tap dancing lessons at the local YWCA. I attended summer camp. What of this experience did I take into my professional life as a journalist? Well, I carried a dedication to tell the stories of strength within communities of color, to give voice to the issues and concerns, and to assure representation, whether from a man on the street interview or comments on major government or other actions. That is my charge, to reclaim agency of my community. Jason?
Thank you so much, Carmen. I want to say also thank you to over 115 folks who've tapped in and joined us here. Thank you so much for being here. And for those who are interested in seeing the video that Marcos has also, it's in the chat. Carmen, your work is incredible, and the way that you point out that reclaiming agency is not something we do alone. It's something that we do with generations that have come before us, learning from them, preserving their voices, centering their voices. I really, really appreciate all that you've shared and the work you've done. So last in this first round of panel questions, Mayor Lamar Thorpe, what you've been doing with the city of Antioch is nothing short of exceptional. As a Chinese American person myself, I'm incredibly touched and proud to hear of the work you've been doing. And Mayor Thorpe, we're going to direct the same question to you. And I know before you respond personally, you've got a short video as well to introduce us into some of the work that you and your city have been doing. So Cam, if we can run that, folks, check this out.
A very dark period of its history. Decades ago, the city forced Chinese Americans out. KPIX5's Wilson Walker live in Antioch with how the city is owning up to a racist past. Wilson?
Ellen, they announced that this apology would be offered a couple months ago, and the crowd that showed up today was genuinely moved, not just by what was on the paperwork, but I think what was said, a real consensus among everyone there that what happened today could really be a model for places across the country.
Today, we, as the city of Antioch, take a dose of humility by acknowledging our troubled past and seeking forgiveness.
The city of Antioch stood up to face its own history today.
Right here in this area, all Chinese Americans were forced to leave their home in Antioch.
The document signed today is in part a listing of those sins, one after another.
Whereas the Chinese residents were forced out, Chinatown was burned to the ground, and Antioch made headline news. Headline news. The Caucasian Torch, wrote the Sacramento Bee.
The proclamation also calls for atonement and an effort to shed more light on this piece of Antioch history, including the tunnels that persecuted residents built under their homes and businesses when sundown laws forced them off of the streets at night.
This is the first apology that's made by any government agency in the country, and I think it's a very courageous move, and it sets a very good precedent.
So for those on hand today, the hope is that this city's apology will lead to more discussions about America's past and more reconciliation.
Although sometimes justice may come late, but it will come eventually.
I want to thank the mayor and the city council for an extremely courageous act in signing of this proclamation. It is an uncomfortable era of our history, but it is a history that needs to be remembered. So thank you all, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this ceremony.
All right, so what comes after the apology? The city is, like I said, looking at making some sort of historical designations about this area as where Chinatown once sat. And they're also talking about something in the way of reparations for families that might have owned property here. The city has hired a consultant to see how that might work. So the work continues. We are live here in Antioch. Wilson Walker, KPIX 5.
Yes, Mayor Thorpe, please, this historic formal apology and proclamation, would love to hear more about that process and how you've been doing this work to own this history.
Well, I'll be honest, I didn't think we'd garner so much attention. That was a local clip from our local regional news, but I've been on NPR, the Washington Post, New York Times, and obviously your executive director, who I went to high school with, read about me in the LA Times recently as it relates to this. And so we were able to reconnect. But I want to be, there's something that Carmen has behind her, and it says, being Black is not a crime. And literally this all started, and the only reason we're even here today for myself and as a city is because of the Black Lives Matter movement last year. And that is literally the beginning for me and for those of us who were elected in 2020, where we were able to redefine what our stories were and what agency we have in effect to telling our stories. All I did was propose a simple police reform ad hoc committee, and everybody lost their minds because they were uncomfortable with talking about policing in our country. But guess what? I wasn't wrong. After my committee was voted down and the city council decided to do some other things, I became the mayor with the largest margin in the history of the oldest city in California. And so I made my own history as well. So I can't take, I believe folks like me who were elected in 2021 under the banner of Black Lives Matter have a social responsibility to ensure that every group in our nation, irrespective of who they are, get to be truly woven into the fabric of our country. It's the only right thing to do. And so when we got to the point where we effectively were talking about a lot of this anti-Asian American hate that we were seeing throughout the country, that was obviously stemmed from former President Trump, it became a side note as it related to the larger Black Lives Matter movement, and I thought that was wrong. Second, there was an element to this discussion about AAPI hate that I did not like. The first one was, why are Blacks and Latinos doing all of this to Asian Americans? Why is it that on the news, you are seeing in urban centers like San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, New York, Los Angeles, wherever, images of young Black men and young Latino men beating the crap out of elderly Asian Americans, which turned my stomach. The thing that I don't like is that, in fact, when you look at the numbers, it is the case that it was a lot of Latino and young Black men who are doing these things. The second thing that I didn't like was that we were taking all this out of context. When you say, why are Blacks doing this to Asians? It's out of a historical context. The United States has a violent history. It has an absolutely violent history towards everybody. And so it was important for me as a Black mayor to stand up, help tell this story, but more important, put it in its historical context, which is we had been displacing and torturing Chinese Americans and Asian Americans for a long, long time in this country that had nothing to do, to begin with African Americans or young Latinos. And so in my city, I wanted to excavate that history, put it on the front page so that there is historical context to the learned behavior many groups have adopted from this country. And it was, and I don't say that you know, I'm a proud U.S. Navy veteran, 8 years. I was willing to die for this country. So I don't say these criticisms because I hate America, or I don't want anyone twisting my words. I love this country and I love the people of this country, but I'm also not going to turn the blind eye to the realities and the histories of our country and the importance of us being able to stand up and share our stories as Americans, all of us. And so this all started with a proclamation condemning Asian American violence in our country. It felt empty to me because this country has never apologized to myself or Carmen for the misdeeds, or for anybody else on this panel for its misdeeds. So I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to slap some language on a piece of paper and make people feel good without any real substance to it. So the second thing I decided to do was to formally apologize to early Chinese immigrants that came to Antioch and their descendants and the larger Asian American community. Second, we were going to do something where we as a city council will fund some type of exhibit at our historical society, at our historical museum, to commemorate the history of Chinese immigrants in our community. Third, we were going to redesignate what is now called Waldy Plaza as Antioch's historic Chinatown, and use that as a living monument museum to early Chinese immigrants and their descendants. And so we didn't want to make this empty. Currently, we're in the process of hiring 2 consultants. One's for the historic Chinese project, and another for the museum, where we want to make sure that we, people who have nothing to do with Chinese early history, are not telling the story of other people. And so that is what we're doing here in the process that we're engaging in to ensure that we're telling the right story on behalf of people. All this seems seamless, but in the process you get called, you get called a racist. I get called a racist for bringing up, quote, problems of the past that have nothing to do to today, when in fact they have absolutely everything to do with today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mayor Thorpe, for your work. As a Chinese American, as an American, as a Californian, I really appreciate that. And I appreciate this idea that you have that came up as you shared, is that owning history means owning all of the history, right? We have to know, just as Marcos was sharing, this fact that, I live on occupied, on unceded Tongva, Hahamongna land. I live in Pasadena. And when we confront our history is when we can grow from it. And that's the agency, right? Instead of simply accepting and moving forward with the momentum that we inherited. So thank you so much. Now, I would like to call all of our panelists back up onto stage. This next round of questions, I'd ask us to keep it a little brief because we are, running a little behind, but, happens when there's such a wealth of knowledge at the table. But for all 3 of our panelists, and y'all can share whenever, I want to focus next on this idea, not just of memory and agency, but collective memory, right? It's so easy to say that wasn't mine. It's so easy for me to look, again, as a Chinese American, as somebody who didn't grow up in Southern California, easy for me to say, oh, the uprising was not, the LA uprising, that's not my personal history. Easy to say, my family wasn't here, so that wasn't my history. Easy even in the context of the Chinese American Museum's commemoration of the 1871 Chinatown Massacre. Very easy for us to say, hey, our families weren't there, or that wasn't me that did it. But we don't move forward that way, right? That's when history becomes inert. So, just throwing it out there, y'all have all taken pieces of history and made them alive, not only for your communities, but for those around you. And I think there's something powerful in making something collective, in sharing something that was ours, and now making it something that others can participate in and learn from. So how do you do that? How do you take those steps to push this history and get these ideas out of insular, out of ethnic and racial and geographic communities, and make them part of our shared collective present? And anyone can please jump in.
Well, I would say that technology makes sharing these stories across cultures and platforms a lot easier now than it was in 1871 or even 1921 or even in the 1990s. And I'm particularly interested, this is me personally, in getting these stories and memories to the extent possible from our elders. One of the things that airing the T-Town documentary animated was the urgent need to identify and record the recollections of the survivors. And one such survivor appeared at a congressional hearing in May to give her recollections, and she was 104 years old. Another byproduct was a push to include study of the Tulsa Massacre in curriculum statewide. Now, I have no idea how that will be affected by the recent backlash against the so-called critical race theory, or as I think, telling of the truth. Lastly, a team of archaeologists is now exploring the sites believed to be the location of the mass graves. And last I checked, some 20 or so remains have been found, and the efforts are being made to identify them, probably thanks to DNA technology that is new and ever progressing. So these tools, I think, and commitments that didn't exist at the time of the massacre help us to share the stories a little more easily.
Thank you, Carmen. Powerful technology platforms. It's easier to distribute information. Yeah, Marcos, Mayor Thorpe, what do y'all think? How do we share these things and help others own them the same way we've come to own them?
Go ahead, Mayor.
Well, there are, I'm with Carmen on technology, but I think it's I don't know. I just think that not to dwell on the world of social media, but I think some technologies have been taken advantage of. Where we're now believing nonsense that we shouldn't be believing in the first place, and it's easy to take advantage. You know, you have the keyboard warriors out there, and the people who get their degrees from Facebook U telling us what our history is and what critical race theory is. And so those can be components so technology, you know, I'm all for it, but we have to be careful as well. And the reason we're going to hopefully be investing heavily in our museum and repurposing our public spaces so that we do share these stories is for that very reason, because we don't want people to hijack this stuff and then try to use it as political weaponry. And so technology is good and hopefully integrated with our traditional modes of storytelling as well.
Yeah, I love it.
I know that.
Oh yeah, Marcos.
Yeah, no, I know that education is probably the most problematic way to address these things, because anytime you look at the reform for standards curriculum in a state, you have an endless debate and an endless clamor for inclusion and a clamor about exclusion that I think is just a part of the divisiveness of the society that we're living in. But I think that the education that takes place on the street is extremely important also. So those social media warriors really don't need much if happening on the street. That if there is an impactful social media based message, there has to be one that's actually taking place in person. I mean, what comparison can we make between somebody who gets a nice hashtag going and puts up a nice TikTok video to a 104-year-old survivor of a massacre giving living testimony before Congress, which I was lucky enough to hear part of, and to be able to witness that. I think the reality, though, and some of the challenges that we're facing, and I'll speak in our community, but I know that that's something we share, is that these struggles are ongoing. I come from a country where there are mass graves being discovered on a daily basis,
where the government apparatus itself is in collusion with the violent forces of the country, which are also in collusion with the government of this government to kill people in ways that we are commemorating of 150 years ago. We have mass graves all over Mexico, all over Central America, all over South America that are tied to the benefit of the economic advancement of this country and of the political domination of the world of this country. So I'm sorry to say that while we recognize that the indigenous peoples of San Nicolas Island today should not have been forcibly removed, that island is owned and operated by the US Navy and is actively being kept as a top secret for bombing, for testing missiles. To do what? To control the rest of the world. And so we can't simply think that in some way we're in a bubble, in a shelter here where we're all going to get along in the United States of America, while we can then bomb everybody else, starve everybody else, kill everybody else, and not recognize that we have to be a part of an entire ecosystem, both in terms of the climate, in terms of our water, in terms of the land, in terms of the people and the societies that the faces that we see on the screen today represent, having come from different parts of this world.
And I think too, you can't give short shrift to the importance of person-to-person connections, vis-a-vis and cross-cultural interactions and learning from one another on a personal basis. And that can be vis-a-vis either religious organizations or universities or indeed museums and or other institutions that can lead the way with that. I wanted to mention to Marcos, he's probably aware, but I've recently, and recently means the last 20 years or so, learned about the scholarship of an Oklahoman by the name of Angie Debo, who, and that's D-E-B-O, whose specialty was researching the treatment of Native American or indigenous people in Oklahoma, which, as you may know, Okla means home of Homa, the red people. And it was supposed to be a whole state. But Angie Debo's scholarship is outstanding. And many of you more recently have seen Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grand, which is going to be I think a Netflix series soon about the treatment of the Osage Indians in Oklahoma. Just horrifying stories, but that need to be told and retold.
Yes, thank you so much, folks, for all of that insight. Mayor Thorpe talking about critical awareness, right? Not just receiving content, but understanding and parsing out, building the picture, building a media literacy, so that whatever messages we receive, this is at least what I took away from some of what you shared, right? We receive messages from social media, from textbooks, but knowing what sources are credible, knowing what signals that there might be something going on under the surface here, this is all crucial for us to be building this inaccurate memory of the past. And Marcos, what really resonated with me, and you shared so much wisdom, what really resonated with me was interrogating the larger systems, both, you know, our individual and communal culpability in it, but also understanding that these things don't happen in an isolated bubble, right? I think often of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who at the time of his death was conducting the Poor People's Campaign and was speaking out against the Vietnam War. And he said, they're taking Black and brown boys from America and sending them to die and to kill yellow boys in Southeast Asia. And when we see the ways that these systems interconnect, then I think that goes back to the question of, you know, we realize that our communal and individual memories are actually very pertinent to each other when we understand how the world fits together. And so thank you all for sharing. I hope I didn't misinterpret anybody's words. But I'm going to say the third round question. We got some questions from the audience. They're really, really excited to hear your responses. So let's do one final round of questions, sort of an action step kind of thing. Sorry, there's a motorcycle passing. Yeah, there's a third round of questions, and then I'll do a little rapid fire round. But you've all done so much and are doing so much to build this collective memory. I'm sure, again, we have over 100 people tuned in right now, and many more will view on recording. What can they do? What are some actionable steps that can be taken to move forward in solidarity, right? There's becoming aware of history. And then there's exactly what you all embody, which is living out and changing and making reparations, making restoration of what's been taken. What are some actionable steps that the audience should consider as if they want to not only learn about these histories, but also change and restore and renew? And this is again for sort of everyone. So if any of y'all have your wisdom and your experience to offer, or websites, organizations, or books to let folks be aware of, please throw it out there.
Well, I think it all starts at the local level, that we should have a one-on-one personal relationship with either your local selectmen or mayors or town or city officials, because what Mayor Thorpe accomplished, that started at that level with a one-to-one and awareness. So I think part of our job or mission is to build awareness and share the information that we've gained through various sources. And again, I reiterate the importance and the need for as much cross-cultural interaction so we understand each other better and can better become allies to one another in these forces that we are all dealing with.
Yeah, being involved. I've realized so many folks in the Asian American Pacific Islander community don't even know that there are town hall meetings. There are all of these opportunities to get in touch with elected officials, or to support friends, or for yourself to run and become an elected official, as Mayor Thorpe himself did. Participation in government, especially local government, is so crucial. And often there are not de jure barriers, but there's these de facto barriers that keep so many of our communities of color outside of those halls of power, because we just don't think of it. We just don't know how the system works. That's a great point, Carmen. Mayor Thorpe or Marcos, what are some action steps? What are some things that people here who want to get involved more that they can do? What are y'all thoughts?
Oh, I think people just need to go out there and break all the stupid conventional rules and not follow the rules. I think all of my life I've been told you can't do this, that's not the way you do it, it shouldn't be done that way. All the rules say this is how everything is prescribed this particular way. And I have to be honest with you, if I would have listened to any of those people, I probably would still be nothing. I come from nothing, and so if I listen to those people, I would still be nothing. So breaking conventional rules, I think is so important. Doing things that make other people feel uncomfortable is also very important. And again, I can't emphasize enough that last year's Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd was about literally liberating me from owning your discomfort and saying that, this is what it is. And if you have a problem with it, that's your problem. It's not my problem. And you are the problem if you don't understand it. And so I just can't emphasize enough how important it is for folks to break every conventional rule you can possibly think of.
I'm coming to terms with wanting to appreciate the call to consciousness that we see happening in our communities. That it's such a weird time right now to see some sense of normalcy in the streets of Los Angeles when only 12 months ago everything was so different. Police cars being in downtown, windows being smashed in Santa Monica, and today, you know, it might as well have never happened physically, because all of that can be repaired in an instant. I'm challenged to balance my personal discomfort with not doing enough to change the conditions that we live in, and know that I'm burdening my children, my grandchildren, my descendants with the ongoing problems that our ancestors, you know, only 50 years ago challenged in such different ways and difficult ways, and we know that there is in many ways we can see that change. You know, we can see mayors like Mayor Thorpe today, where 50 years ago we never would have. But on the other hand, we know that there's so much more to go, and that it's not a still target. You know, that there is so much to grapple with, and not to the least of which is climactic and environmental, and that it really does challenges humanity to grapple with. You know, just thinking about the oil spill on the coast of Southern California, and how bad that's going to really reflect on the lack of sustainability. But you know, the lesson that I'm trying to learn in this stage of my own development and working with others is best shared by Loretta Ross in a short TED talk that she shared, and the work of the Racial Equity Organization in calling in as a discipline instead of just calling people out. Finding ways for us to find those examples of collaboration that we can have, to find that, whether we want to call it co-conspiracy, or as I love hearing some of the women leadership asking men not just to be co-conspirators, but to be traitors to their gender, traitors to the patriarchy. And I think that those really are going to be the steps that we take, as the mayor is indicating. We should, you know, venimos a contradecir. We come to contradict, my teachers would tell me. But we want to also do it in a way where we're uniting people in that.
Yeah, I love that, Marcos. I love the idea of being traitors to wicked systems. One of my favorite thinkers, James Halcone, the godfather of Black theology, speaks about those who align away from the oppressor, those who could be aligned with the oppressor, but they choose instead, or they learn instead, to be with the oppressed, not just to identify with the oppressed, not just to think about the oppressed, but to be aligned materially, physically, spiritually with the oppressed. And thank you for that call to solidarity, and that reminder that this is our way forward, is together. So we do have, this is great. We are right back on time. If anyone has any other thoughts, happy to continue hearing those, but we got some questions from the audience. We've got some great guests here with us in the audience. And so the first question, anyone can answer. I'll sort of rephrase it. And the phrase that comes to my mind when I read this question is the oppression Olympics, right? I think those of us who work in activism or work in community work are sadly accustomed to seeing this quote unquote oppression Olympics happen. And what happens is somebody says, oh, well, hey, this happened to my community, so we just need to take care of ourselves. And then someone else goes, well, we can't help you because this thing happened that's even worse to ours. And the next thing you know, we're all fragmented and fractured. And so someone in the audience is asking, how do we surmount that? How do we get to a place of solidarity where we're not thinking about looking after our own? We're not thinking in these sort of small tribal ways. We're thinking about larger connections and owning each other's and being involved in each other's struggles. What do we do? How do we surmount those barriers that keep us apart? Mayor Thorpe.
Well, I was just gonna say that everyone has their own unique journey, and they're not comparable. you can certainly draw similarities. And I'm always puzzled by exactly what you're saying when folks want to say, oh, well, you know, this group had it harder than that group. And there are certainly aspects to everything. And so I've always found that odd. But I think that comes from a way that we've been conditioned to think, and that's someone's here to take something from you. And it's generally, you know, generally people of color who are looking at each other saying, well, that person takes this and I don't have this. Meanwhile, somebody else has the largest piece of the cookie. And so I think that's just the way we've been conditioned to that. There is no such thing as anybody else had it harder than the next person, or excuse me, the next group. Everybody has a unique history as it relates to this country, and that's their story. And you can certainly draw similarities, but they're not comparable to anybody else's history.
Love that. Marcos, Carmen, any thoughts on how we get our people, our communities, to push past this zero-sum game, this idea that focusing on your thing means less focus on my thing? Oh, Carmen, you are muted right now.
It's a question for the ages. Again, I think curiosity is part of the formula to be curious about others and be willing to extend oneself to other communities, other people. It can be as informal as striking up a conversation at a coffee shop, or organizing a group to come to a museum, the Chinese American Museum, or just finding large and small ways to expand your knowledge about the others. And that's how you find eventually some common ground, I believe.
I love it. Curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Curiosity. I was at Sinai Temple in Beverly Hills a couple years ago for a Martin Luther King Jr. Day commemoration. And I remember Rabbi Wolpe at Sinai Temple, Beverly Hills, said, the greatest tragedy is when people who have been hurt turn around and say, we've been hurt, and therefore we don't have to, therefore we're just going to retreat into ourselves. He said the greatest grace is when those who have been hurt let that experience of hurt deepen their compassion, deepen their empathy, increase the humanity that they have and that they see in others who are hurting. And it's a choice, isn't it? That hurt can make us cut ourselves off from others, or hurt can make us extend ourselves to others. And what I hear in you saying, talking about curiosity, is that extension and that reaching to others. Yeah. So there's another question from the audience, and I'd love, Marcos, if you have thoughts on this, if you'd like to jump in on this. Somebody asks, so the way they phrase it is, how do you have grace and patience for mainstream America when mainstream America either does not acknowledge violence that's happened against our communities, or acknowledges it, but acts as though it's new, as though it's never happened before, and as though it's only happening now? And I would perhaps edit the question to say, do you extend grace and patience, or, you know, how does that work in your eyes?
Well, I think as an educator, you know, I'd like to think that I'm trained to come from a place of finding what knowledge is already there to begin with, as opposed to assuming that it's the place of ignorance, and that based on those funds knowledge, that common ground of culture and understanding that every human being has culture, every human being has language, every human being has an experience with the human condition, that there are ways for us to be able to find that commonality. You know, the way Studs Terkel can capture the average worker's life in his work, and that we can see ourselves in that, even though you know, there weren't any Mexicans in that story per se, or indigenous workers in that story per se. but that we can see ourselves in those experiences as workers, as family people. But there is, as you mentioned, also a line to be drawn, maybe boundaries to be understood, that shouldn't become my burden to have to carry, as others have addressed, that there is a responsibility on the other part for there to be reciprocity to what is being shared. My Wing Chun instructor, Tom Wang Hua, he's taught me so many different values from that kind of that framework of cultural understanding. And one of them was that Americans didn't have any concept of what it meant to be a martial arts master and what was involved in the level of sacrifice to be able to actually take on that responsibility, and then want to pay you $20 a week to go to a rec room class and feel like they've got to earn their black belt, and have you just download everything on them. And that really demonstrated to me a commonality that I understood with him in terms of our indigenous knowledge and his knowledge in the field of Wing Chun martial arts. That was just this gap that you can't close in a lifetime. There are things we can't share enough. There isn't enough time to immerse ourselves in that unless the other person dives in to that reciprocity, and then that can happen and beautiful things can emerge. But I think that's also something that mainstream, so-called mainstream America, depending on what side of the coast you're on, is mainstream looks different on the West Coast and on the East Coast than it does in the middle of the continental United States. But there's still that has to be that understanding of how deep the knowledge is, and how superficial maybe Hollywood makes things look.
Well, I add that Jason has brought up Dr. Martin Luther King twice now, and so I'll remind everybody that he once said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And what is it that America has failed to hear, to see? And so I grew up in Los Angeles, where Carlos is now at, in El Sereno. And I grew up through what back in those days we used to call the LA riots. And today I more appropriate call it the LA revolt, because people weren't being heard and patience had run out as it related to the Los Angeles Police Department and the African American community. And so, at some point, we can be as accommodating as possible, but I just have to, I keep going. I think a lot of people wanted to see like material things come out of last year's Black Lives Matter movement. But I think that, to Carlos's point, there was this consciousness awakening as it relates to these types of issues, and owning of some of mainstream owning some of its failings in the past, and unfortunately, it took being very, very loud, revolting on the streets to get that attention and to finally get people to wake up. And while we describe the LA riots as the LA riots, I just have to remind everybody that sparked critical reforms in the Los Angeles Police Department that took a lot of power away from the chief of police, and created an independent. So all these different things came out of that, and so it's this interesting thing, the idea of being patient, and when in fact we know that since the very beginning of the founding of the country, not necessarily the history of the lands, but the founding of this country has literally been people revolting and being mad at each other and throwing desks and chairs and blowing things up in order to achieve what they perceive as justice.
Yeah, you have to be heard. You have to be heard, and when you're not heard, it's hard. I remember the signs I saw of respect existence or expect resistance, and ideally people can care for each other, and when they can't, humanity will insist on ourselves and insist on that until we are seen, and hopefully we can do that together. Right, so we're coming towards the very sort of tail end of the program. We've got a couple words from Michael coming up again, but before we get there, and remember, we're going to take one last group photo at the end. But before we get there, I'd like to invite all of our speakers. Thank you so much for your thoughts on our collective memory topic, as well as answering these questions from the audience. I'd love to hear sort of like, let's go around. If you have any words to reflect on what you just heard from your colleagues, to offer to the audience, words of encouragement or exhortation or even hope, anything that you'd like to say as we begin landing this plane and finishing up this panel discussion.
Well, as the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was a student of Dr. King's as well, used to always say, keep hope alive. And I know in these times that is probably easier said than done, but it's still an important mantra. Keep hope alive, keep your eyes, your ears, and your heart open to the humanity of all people. And remember, we shall overcome someday.
I love that. Thank you. Marcos or Mayor Thorpe, any last words for our audience?
I'm looking for ways to learn how to make love deeper and broader and really something that is a shared experience as community. It's not easy. There's still a lot of pain and there's still a lot to work through. But I do think that next to hope, love is important. But it has to be a revolutionary love, a love that is not afraid to question, that is not afraid to contradict, that is not afraid to hold up truths to power, that is a rooted love. No, not the kind of love that just comes and goes with an easy breeze, you know, the kind of love that can stay strong like the seaweed in the ocean. You know, that those deep kelp forests that I've had the privilege of swimming through between here and the islands is something that gives life and gives sustenance. And sometimes I think we're confused about that too.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much. Strong love. Yeah. And Mayor Thorpe, please close out the panel with your thoughts.
Well, I have many thoughts, but I won't give you all the thoughts today. There was some words that I saw on Carlos's slide that I thought were very, well, I had to write it down because I said, oh, this is important. To heal the world, we heal ourselves. And I think when we take micro actions at the local level, we have a global impact. And so when I say we didn't anticipate all this attention in Antioch as it related to this apology, but the apology had a global impact. And so little things like that can go a long, long way. And so in a long, long way to healing personally. I'll read you the last kind of be it resolved from our resolution, which says, express its commitment to rectify the lingering consequences of the misdeeds committed against early Chinese immigrants under, before, and during the driving out. Seek forgiveness for the acts of fundamental injustice, terror, cruelty, and brutality. And that was written in our apology. Seeking forgiveness is so, so important. It's not just apology, it's seeking forgiveness for our wrongs is so, so important. And I really believe that to heal the world, we heal ourselves. This is to me that was captured in our resolution. And of course, I would be remiss not to emphasize again that being Black is not a crime. And that proclamation that many of us made last year is what brought us to this moment, at least for the city of Antioch, and for those of us who are involved in social justice activism. to this point. And I think it's important to recognize that generally as minority groups, we think of ourselves. We were not. We were thinking about everybody as African Americans. And so I think that's so important to understand. And those are my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mayor Thorpe. I love it. Yeah, healing, forgiveness, love, hope. These are great notes to end this panel on. And I just got to say, for me as a Chinese American man who's in, the hip hop space, who is in the activism space, my family would not be in this country were it not for Black civil rights leaders. This country would not be here and be tended to if it weren't for those who've taken care of the land for generations, the indigenous folks that have not ceded this land. And the grace that y'all have to participate in this conversation, the grace that y'all have to do this work, it gives me hope, because it reminds me that no step forward is ever taken alone. Like you said, Mayor Thorpe, context is everything. Historical context is everything. So thank you. Before we close out though, I want to invite Michael from the Chinese American Museum back again to wrap up the program and to let us know how we're finishing out today. So folks, audience members, if y'all can welcome Michael Trong back on stage. He will help us finish out.
Thank you, Jason. And, thank you to the rest of the panel. This really was an insightful and honest conversation that was much needed, and it really supports what we do as a museum to tell not just the Chinese American stories, but a story of America and what it is and who we are. We have many more programs and many more panel discussions and workshops and virtual presentation for the rest of the week. Each day you'll receive an email for the following programs. And I want to let you know that CAM is open Friday through Sunday, so please visit us from 10 to 3. I encourage you to visit the museum, but also see a newest exhibition, Collective Resilience, Asian Americans Artists Honoring Our Community Strength and Unity. Jason, I'd like to pass it over to you for the final words.
Yes, sir. Y'all, it was such a pleasure to be with you. I saw who the panelists were going to be, and I was frankly quite intimidated because I just make music, y'all. And these people are out here changing and moving the world and their cities and their communities. I just want to give a huge shout out to all of our panelists for their time, their preparation, and more importantly, what they're doing out there when we're not on this Zoom call. So thanks to all of them. Thank you so much to the Chinese American Museum. I'm a huge fan, and I'm proud and honored to be a part of the family and part of these proceedings. And everyone else, I hope y'all get home safe, stay home safe, be well, stay warm in this unseasonable weather in LA. And it's been a real pleasure being with y'all and learning from you. Take care, folks.